Law Talk with BJ, the podcast where trial attorney and legal commentator BJ Bernstein and her guests discuss the latest issues from around the legal world. BJ is a frequent commentator on television and radio. She's unique in that she not only comments on legal issues, having been lead counsel on numerous high-profile cases of national interest, but her relatable personal style allows the viewer to understand the law behind the headlines and why it's important. Now, here's your host, BJ Bernstein.
Welcome to Law Talk with BJ. Today's a very important topic, particularly if you are a parent or if you are under 18 years old and listening to the podcast. It's because I have the honor of having His Honor, the Chief Presiding Judge of the Fulton County Juvenile Court, Judge Bradley Boyd, is joining us to talk about what happens in juvenile court. Welcome.
Thank you.
So you have been a judge for a very long time and practicing law, and I understand will be retiring soon from the bench.
I will, right at the end of the year. I've been a judge for, it'll be about 13 years, although I've been employed at the juvenile court since, for a little over 46 years.
So you have seen quite a change in the work of the court from 46 years ago to now in so many different ways. Just overall, before we start getting into the actual business of the court, what are some of the things that you've seen over the years in terms of the shift of the work of the court and the young people that appear before you in that court?
Well, I do recall in about 1986, I think, is when crack cocaine really sort of exploded on the streets of Atlanta. And that made a huge impact because that has sort of a cascading effect in terms of what young people got involved with and what and how that causes other things that they get involved with. Because there were drugs being sold. They're young people that we probably used to see coming in for shoplifting discovered that you don't have to shoplift, that you can make money selling drugs. And so we saw shoplifting cases plummet dramatically at about the same time that drug possession cases were going up for some of the juveniles. And getting into that whole culture of the drugs distribution, there's a lot of money floating around in that environment. And because it was attached to the drug trade, people couldn't really rely on law enforcement to sort of protect them and their assets. And so they decided they needed to protect themselves, and gun charges went up. At the same time drugs hit the street, so did guns. And then drugs started getting exchanged for stolen cars, or cars would get stolen and exchanged for cash to buy drugs. It was this network that sort of grew out of this explosion of drugs on the street. And then on the other side of the coin, there are parents that now were getting involved with drugs, and we were seeing child welfare cases developing because of children that were being neglected or abused or had to be taken into care because parents were becoming unable to care for them. So that side of the juvenile court business went up as well. So that was a big change, and that was about 1986 in Georgia. It was earlier at other places, but that is, now that's 20, 30 years ago, but that was a big shift. And then since that time, those major kinds of offenses have become predominant in the way that we look at what's going on in the community.
And your answer kind of points out something that a lot of folks may not realize, because I think we all recognize juvenile court as a place for criminal cases to go for minors. When you're accused and prosecuted You are not part of the adult system, although there can be things where you are a juvenile and in the adult's justice system. But that in general, you have that category cases that you handle as a juvenile court judge, but you also deal with the welfare of the child, neglect, and situations that are families needing supervision for the protection and welfare of the child as well. Is that right?
Yes, when, children can get removed from their parents for any number of reasons, and when the Department of Child Welfare, whatever it is in the various states, take that action, they need to bring the matter to the court, and the courts are then charged with determining whether or not the removal of that child is necessary for the safety of the child, because we also know that when you remove a child from home, even though some bad things may be happening there, just the removal from parents can be very traumatic for a child and can have significant impacts on them, sometimes long term. So you really have to make some determination as to whether or not the child needs to be removed. And then, if so, plans need to be developed as to what kinds of services need to be put in place so the parents can eventually get those children back and to monitor the progress on those case plans. And the truth is that in the court that I work in, and I don't know about courts nationally, but the court that I work in, really more judicial time is spent working on child welfare issues than it is on juvenile delinquency issues.
Interesting, because from listening to the news, you would think really the opposite, because we talk about the supposed growth of crime, that younger people are involved in more serious things than back in the days, if we go back to the 50s and your ideas of what young people were doing or not doing. But that the child welfare part, you surprised me when you shared that to me before we started the podcast. And yet, as I think about it, and we think about all the struggles families have financially and themselves navigating a very difficult world that we're in right now, with a lot of differences, socioeconomic, racial injustices that affect how that parent or family can provide for their child. It creates issues for a court to be able to have to deal with.
Right. And in the last 10, 15 years, research that's been done on child development has started to really have an impact on the way that courts operate. And what we've learned is that, as I mentioned, removal of a child can be very traumatic. Other kinds of things, neglect of a child while they're growing up, can have significant trauma effects on a child to the point where it actually impairs brain development as they're growing.
Mental health issues later manifest into very serious things, which you can either lead to needing help that may not be so available. We've had other podcasts talking about the lack of mental health services available to the public at large. And so that's a disconcerting thing too, because I'm assuming you may see a situation as a judge and you're looking for a solution, and having those services, or do you struggle to find services that will work with these young people who are neglected and there for welfare reasons before you?
They're not easy issues. I mean, you need to look for services and what the child needs. You also look at what the parent needs. And there's a cycle. If parents have been traumatized, if they've been raised in neglectful or harmful situations, they don't have a good background. They don't have the tools that they may need to be parents, and sometimes their children will end up having the same kind of difficulties that they had.
So even though you're a juvenile court, you obviously have the authority over the child, but you also then, in essence, have authority over the adults as well, in terms of coming up with reunification plans or plans because that's something you don't think about, that an adult is under the auspices of a juvenile court.
We have at our court, and there are a number of courts nationally that have family treatment courts. And those are designed to deal with parents who have lost custody of their kids, usually because of substance abuse and addiction issues. So the child can get removed, and you want to, as best you can, maintain the connection with the parents, visitation. You want the parent to get themselves together, to get off drugs. They may have lost homes. They may have lost jobs. There's a lot of things that need to be put back together for the parent. And there are special courts that will bring parents in. Sometimes they come in every week to make sure they're complying with the treatment programs and the treatment plans that have been set up for them. And you really try to push them, encourage them, because ultimately, if they can get things together, that child gets to go home, the family gets to be put back together, and the child is less at risk for other problems later than if they have to be bounced around in the foster care system indefinitely.
And how much supervision or input do you have on the foster care system as a juvenile court judge?
We have quite a bit, actually. We must first of all make a determination whether the child's removal was necessary, and that hinges on whether the child is harmed or is in danger in a situation. When I first came into the system, and any child where if the home was poor, if the furniture was dirty and broken down, if housing was substandard, often those children would get removed. Or if there was any kind of issue that raised some concerns about, well, this child may be at risk, we'll just take the child and make sure that he or she is safe. And then we learned that when we take these children out and put them in foster homes, that's not good for them either. So first of all, we need to decide whether or not the court gets to decide whether or not that removal is valid. If it's not, the child goes home and we put services in the home while the child is there. And secondly, if they are removed, then the laws require frequent reviews of that case to determine, is mother making progress? Here's the case plan. Here's what mother's charged with doing. Is she doing it? Is she really making that a priority? And if not, why not? What needs to be done? Do things need to be changed or some sanctions put in place? And we're always holding the thing up here that if we can, after a certain amount of time, a child's been out of home, maybe has started bonding with a foster parent or something like that, that somewhere along the line, a determination needs to be made. Should this child go home, or do all rights need to be terminated and we seek adoption? That whole process is overseen by the court.
Since you've been doing this for so long, and you've talked about these changes from the 80s, and we're now in 2019, and you're getting ready to retire, if you had a magic wand of something that could be added, or a resource, or something that would help improve this part of the court, we're going to get to the delinquency in a minute, but the welfare of the child, what type of help or resources or changes do you think need to be made to whether the laws or the funding or the system itself?
Well, I will say that there is a huge change coming. In fact, it's practically in progress now. A lot of how the juvenile court operates and the priorities and what the juvenile court must do has been established by national legislation. And there is the Family First legislation that has passed recently that the effective date is 2019. Some states are allowed to get waivers to put all this in place. But it means that a lot of the federal dollars that have gone to support the child welfare system, which have gone to foster care, which have gone to providing treatment, a lot of those dollars are going to go into prevention programs. Now, what that's and this is what people in the child welfare system have been saying for years.
Begging for, I guess.
Begging for it. If we can, the argument was it's a lot less expensive to prevent these problems from coming than to try to fix them after things break down. We'll see. So what's going to be on the agenda nationally in all the states is having to put together an array of services and a system that will identify problems before they get to the point of removal, before they get to the point where they have to go to juvenile court, and put in place supportive programs, rehabilitative programs. The states will come up with various plans and programs that they think will be effective in actually preventing what has been a growth of the dependency cases.
Do you have a sense of where that's going to come in? Because you're saying things that would happen before the court would know something's wrong,
Actually,
which seems confusing since a court is usually reacting to an action on the outside that brings it to court.
yeah. And this is going to change the role of the court as well, because when these prevention plans are put in place, that is also going to be overseen by the court. The court's going to, it's like bringing the court into a case before a court case has been established. So it's a huge paradigm shift.
And I guess the first question also that pops out for me from that is, we're lawyers first. We were trained as lawyers. We weren't necessarily, now some people probably have some background in social work and those kind of things. How are the judges going to get trained or add, or is that in the discussion now? Or are you seeing changes in training now?
There will be. In our state, the judges meet twice a year for various kinds of training, and I'm sure that the training that's coming up for Georgia judges in early October will start addressing some of, and we've been hearing about a lot of the planning has been going on within the child welfare department and system, and as they develop the programs that they want to put in place, then the judges will learn about those programs and start becoming to an understanding of what exactly we need to do to monitor progress, monitor the success of those programs. It's, you're right. As lawyers, it seems a little sticky because we like things to be defined. You're guilty or you're not. You've got a court case. It's there in court or it's been dismissed. And so this whole I'm
going to have to do a podcast in a couple months, it sounds like, and follow this more carefully, which, because what affects one child affects many. I mean, it may be that you think you'll never have those kind of issues in your family, but one, you never know when your economic circumstances change, whether there's something that mental health issue happens in your family that all of a sudden you're dealing with welfare issues that you didn't imagine for your child.
A lot of cases are based on behavioral mental health, and so you were talking about the magic wand. I would love to see a much more robust mental health program that's really established in communities that has outreach and has where folks don't have to come look after a problem is developed, where there is a kind of outreach and a feel in the community for mental health professionals to start identifying things that could be addressed and create situations, forums, venues where education about mental health and behavioral health issues can be presented to the community. Because there's a certain stigma still to receiving mental health services, and it keeps some people from addressing things that could and should be addressed much earlier in their experience.
And some of those folks end up and that's going to lead me to the other side of your work in the court, and that's the delinquency side, which it's an interesting word that we've clung to. We were saying delinquency of minors because if you're an adult, you're arrested and you're a defendant in a criminal case. On the child side, we're saying the word delinquent. We're not calling someone a criminal per se. There is this distinction made. But the ages have shifted as to, and by location and states, and when you're considered a juvenile if you've committed an offense, or whether even as a legal juvenile you can end up in adult court because you've alleged to have committed a murder or some other very serious offense that puts you there. So let's talk about, in general, the role of you as a judge and the basic process of handling a case in which a young person is accused of committing a crime.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, children who are impacted by these sometimes very significant kinds of trauma, sometimes it's a very young child, it affects brain development. It affects child emotional development. And so it's not surprising that children that are exposed to that would develop some behavioral problems. And when a 4-year-old or 5-year-old or 8-year-old is acting out, and it's clear that that child has had a tumultuous kind of family experience, we understand that. So, and I've tossed this out to people before. I said, okay, so at 8 years old, that's a child that's had issues with behavior. What about when they're 12? What about when they're 13 or 15? At what point do you decide that that child is no longer a victim of the trauma
and circumstances that
they grew up in?
Right, education.
And at what point then have they become a thug? And that's, and I think that the way that juvenile, youthful offending, juvenile delinquency, crime by teens, however that you want to call it, the way that that gets presented in the public is through the media, and it tends to latch on to the serious, violent, sensational kinds of things that young people do. And so it sort of creates this general thought that if I'm seeing some kid on the street and they're doing things that look to me like that's not what they should be doing, then I'm scared of them.
And you know from your experience, it can be a number of things. I mean, first of all, also mental health issues. We can't diagnose certain things, whether it's schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, till you're much older, and yet it's not that it's already not manifesting at a much younger age.
We know that young people's brains develop on a pace. I mean, the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that governs impulsivity and decision-making, the executive function of the brain, doesn't really fully develop until probably the mid-20s. And so kids are hardwired to make stupid decisions. But there's a great deal of lack of understanding or forgiveness for those kids doing that.
Do you find as a juvenile court judge, though, that when they're in front of you or your colleagues that you have that realization and you're then trying to put together a plan? I realize that there are juvenile justice places where they're incarcerated, but trying to avoid that. And is there a shift to avoid that more than we used to?
We've realized that studies show that the incarceration of juveniles does not only does it do very little in terms of actual rehabilitation, it actually makes things worse. Recidivism rates for young people that are locked up as opposed to young people that are put into evidence-based programs.
When you say evidence-based programs, what do you mean?
These are programs that have been put in place. They've been tried. They operate in a very specific manner. They usually have a particular curriculum. The people who do them are taught and trained to conduct those programs in a certain way, and they have been evaluated and studied over time at different places in different environments and found to be effective. They're called evidence-based because there has been research and evaluations done and say these work.
And who runs these evidence-based organizations?
A number of private organizations do. We have nonprofits do. There are people that will be trained to do it. And in the court where I work, we have a grant to fund several evidence-based programs for young people that in the past, when we didn't have those, these would have been the kids that would have been locked up, that have been sent to a state facility because they had really gone too far in the juvenile justice system. And it's designed, one of them is one evidence-based program called Thinking for a Change. And it's an educational program that essentially teaches kids how to think differently. There's another one called Functional Family Therapy, which is an intensive family therapy program.
So bringing in the parents who may also have struggled with, as an adult, with criminal issues.
Yeah,
and putting everybody together to see how they're influencing each other and perhaps making change.
So there are programs like that. And it's, there's still a mindset. And when I first came to work at the juvenile court many years ago, I thought, I was concerned about kids having guns. And I thought any kid that has a gun ought to spend some time locked up. That would change their behavior. And that was probably not an unusual thing to think at that time. Now I realize that, a kid can find a gun and pick it up and start playing around with it. And of course it's dangerous. But if he gets caught with that gun, and I put him in a detention facility where really the young people that ought to be there, I'm going to quote another judge, that colleague of mine, Judge Teskey, says we ought to be using detention not for the kids that make us mad, but for the kids that scare us. There are some young people whose behavior is indeed a threat to community safety, and they need much different kind of treatment programs, but sometimes they need to be in a secure facility. But I don't want to put some young person in the company of those folks mixing every day if they don't need to be there.
It's interesting you talk about the gun because when I tried my first case as a criminal defense lawyer, it was a murder case of a young man, I think he was 16, maybe being tried as an adult. And I remember they were talking about gang things and all of this stuff, part of the case. But when the police had interviewed my client, they asked him about the gun, to describe the gun. And he said, it's a black cowboy type gun. And that was something I argued to the jury. They had broken into a house, stole some things. In a shoebox, they found the gun in the house. So they took the gun. My client had said he didn't pull the trigger. And I was like, how do you not pull the trigger? And it was horrible. I mean, a mother was killed. He said, I promise you, he kept saying, I didn't pull it. And then I had it checked, and it turned out the original owner had altered the gun for it to be a hair trigger. And that when he pulled up and pointed the gun, she screamed. It caused him to flinch, and he shot and killed her because he was just going to point a cowboy gun. And I think that ties into what you're saying, that we have this idea sometimes, and not to say that it doesn't apply across the board, but that they are still children and describe things as children, and that even at 15, 16, 17, and they're on the cusp of adulthood, and I would argue most 18-year-olds clearly don't know everything that they need to know, that it needs some accommodations and shift, like what you're describing as a judge, to realize they're getting themselves into things much more dangerous because of what's available to them, as opposed to them being, quote, worse human beings.
Yes.
And more dangerous.
Anybody who's raised kids, I think, can understand that any child, good children, very good children, even can make stupid decisions at age 16, 17. And they don't, a lot of children don't suffer from that because their family and the people that they have around them and the people that support them and look after them and care for them can say, wait a minute, really? You want to do that? Think about this a minute. But if nobody's there to do that, that's a bad road that they're on, and they'll follow it.
What about, the other category of cases I guess I see sometimes is young people against other young people, and especially male-female relationships, 15, 16. When you socialize at high school, you are with a group of people who are almost predominantly within the ambit of your court, but there's a whole grade level that potentially is an adult. And you put all of that together. How much, or what do you see in your court that results in crimes or alleged crimes in between each other without, again, the knowledge of where the parameters are of what you can and can't do.
Well, and add to that the fact that young teenagers of that age are vials of hormones, and trying to learn what's okay and how to function as a evolving man or woman. And again, what kind of environment are they living in, and what have they learned about what it really means to be a man or a woman?
And that's not a socioeconomic situation, because there are plenty of people who have parents who are of a wealthy, and they're not getting taught. The discussions are not happening or that need to happen. It's not just a one-sided, whether a matter of socioeconomic situations, racial, ethnic situations. And we're exposed to a lot of media, a lot of adult material, and then no other accompanying explanation that, oh yeah, by the way, if you do that, that's completely illegal.
Yeah.
Depending on your state and jurisdiction.
Yeah, I had what really was a privilege of spending about 12 years working with a program that ultimately was a youth empowerment program. And in involving myself in that program, I met with a number of kids every week. And over that period of time, some kids would come in, and 12 years, they get old and they move out, and other kids come in. And these were kids that had some difficulties themselves. And one of them made his way in there, and he eventually realized that he kind of recognized me because I, as a prosecutor, had prosecuted a case against him and asked him to be locked up. It turned out that he became a leader in that group, along with another young fellow who right now is a pretty successful hip-hop artist. And they started...
Can you tell us who?
Killer Mike.
How about that?
And they started having this conversation with each other. And they said, we got bad information. Some of what got us in trouble is people told us the wrong stuff. And we ought to do something to try to get some good information to these younger kids so that they don't fall into the same kind of mistakes that we've made. And so they actually started working on a curriculum that they started taking into the elementary and middle schools and doing an after-school program for a while, just say, look, some of what you're hearing isn't right.
Because the law says ignorance of the law is no excuse, and yet you're tapping into, we don't do such a good job at teaching the law.
Yeah.
But some folks, even going through it, understand and spread the news, such as Killer Mike and other activists who are out there trying to say, there's a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's encouraging to hear a judge realize and you to be so candid about the shifts you've seen over time. Because it's so easy to get in the law. In the one way, it's magical because it changes, and yet in other ways, that change is sometimes very slow. But it seems to be that we finally are in a period of rapid change and realization of what is it that we are doing with the courts, and that it's punishment is not always, it shouldn't really be the goal. It's a better society.
I think I mentioned these 12 years or so that I was with this organization, and frankly, to me, it was life-changing, and I am forever grateful for that time, because I think it made me a better person and a better judge, because the focus on that was listening. When we talk about youth leadership, it wasn't creating programs for kids to do and participating in. It was saying to the kids, what's going on in your world? What would you like to change, and how can we help you do that? And that led to the adults in the program learning how to listen to young people, because we don't do that very well. And when you actually listen to what young people have to say, and sometimes they don't, it's hard to hear that, because young people aren't used to adults wanting to hear that. When you have a conversation with a kid, really you're letting them talk, but what you're doing is thinking what I want to say next. But if you listen to and can get young people to talk and let you know what they think, they've got some great ideas. They have some thoughts and a lot of what they think can make sense. If we could all find a venue, find a way, and adopt a commitment to, that kid bothers me or whatever. I want to hear what he's got to say. I want to listen to him. I want to listen to her. If that behavior is coming from somewhere, tell me about that. I think the way we might react and the way we might respond to young people could be very different.
That is heartening to hear. It truly is, because, you're so used to, I think in general, thinking of the judge speaking down. You're sitting up higher than everybody else in the courtroom. And so to hear that the court wants to hear from a young person, and I think there is a lot of shifting going on with the judiciary in terms of the relationships of all the parties that are present, whether it's in both juvenile court and the adult courts, of realizing, the numbers are bringing the system down, how many people are having to be involved with the courts, and that perhaps listening, as opposed to making assumptions, could get us into a better place.
It can be life-changing both for the person listening and the person being listened to. It's life-changing.
So while we've been having this wonderful conversation, I can't thank you enough. And I am so pleased to have had this time. I've heard of you. I haven't been before you. It's been really lovely. And I was trying to think about what tea to have, because with every episode of Law Talk with BJ, we have a different cup of tea. And I chose chamomile tea. Not usually I talk about the metabolical different or spiritual benefits of the tea, but this one was because of the children's story, Peter Rabbit, since we're talking about children. And his mother gave him chamomile tea to get well. And after what you've said this whole time, I'm warm and fuzzy realizing we're building a judiciary who wants our children to be well. And I hope that is beyond you. I'm thinking from what you say it is, although you have a special heart for having been at this for so long. So thank you for sharing with our audience. And here's to faith in the future. And we'll clink our little mugs. And thank everyone for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, EJ.
This podcast is not to be construed as legal advice. With any legal issue, you should reach out to a professional attorney that practices law in the state and area of law for which you need information or consultation. Law Talk with BJ does not establish an attorney-client relationship, which is only formed when you have hired an attorney and signed an engagement agreement or contract. It's Law Talk with BJ music theme written and produced by Atlanta Audible. This podcast copyright 2018, BJ Bernstein, Esquire.